Welcome everyone, Costini here with a discussion about the meta of Total War Warhammer 3 and why I think certain races in the game handle far better than others with respect to the campaign dynamics. And also why certain Legendary Lords handle far better in terms of the campaign dynamics versus others. So what defines the meta of Warhammer 3? Well, there's obviously going to be things like growth, control, income that are going to matter. Also casualty replenishment. Races with good casualty replenishment are just going to have a far better campaign experience than others. There's multiple reasons behind the casualty replenishment issue, actually. I would say that's a bit more nuanced than you might think. Because if you have poor casualty replenishment in a particular campaign, it actually might force you when you're playing a particular lord or race to go with less variety of your armies in general. Like if you're playing dwarves, for instance, one of the reasons you always want to go quarrelers is actually because of the poor casualty replenishment, really making a melee army incredibly punishing. Ungrim makes it work with his army of slayers because he has an incredible benefit of casualty replenishment for his army, but overall, that's something that limits you. Good casualty replenishment, growth, control, income does matter. But it's more than that. Like, I wouldn't even say those aren't necessarily the most important things, actually. I would say the first thing that's really important is climate suitability. Now, when I say climate suitability, I am not saying that the best races or the best campaigns are where you have every type of climate in the game viable. No, it's having enough climate types viable that you have a good selection of choices during the course of your campaign. That is what actually matters from my point of view with respect to a campaign. So consider Morafi's campaign here for a moment. She only has Frozen, Chaotic Wasteland, and Temperate Island. But when you consider this in practice, not just theory, you end up with a campaign situation where you can take territory all the way from here to here. And that's just the pleasant part. You can certainly make it work in an unpleasant climate if you've got good enough income control and growth, which she certainly does. That's why it matters. It's not just one system, it's a combination of systems that makes for the meta combination, if you will, of a particular race, and why certain races are far ahead of the meta than others. And Dark Elves are absolutely one of those races, for the reasons of climate. Usually speaking, there are certainly some campaigns where the climate is more limited than others. There are certain legendary lords in the Dark Elf roster that are more limited. There are some that are more flexible. For instance, Malice Darkblade actually is quite a bit more flexible than you might think. You might say, oh, he starts in Chaos Wastelands, but guy's got jungle as a viable guy has jungle as a viable climate type, so he suddenly ends up with a heck of a lot more choice than you might otherwise have in a campaign like this. And that does matter. That does matter a great deal in a campaign. Then there's the issue of diplomacy. One of the things Creative Assembly did was redefine diplomacy with Free Kingdoms. And I would say that there was a significant and positive change because for many years, Creative Assembly had even scaled down diplomacy if we consider the removal of regent trading. Yes, it was broken, it was abused, etc. But I think for a period of years, Creative Assembly was focused more like, oh, how do we prevent the player from abusing mechanics as opposed to improving mechanics, increasing and making for better mechanics in their campaigns. Then came Free Kingdoms, which was a significant redesign to how they handled pretty much everything. Free Kingdom saw vast improvements in AI, in terms of campaign balance, in terms of diplomacy. It was not perfect, and it did fail for a reason as a game. But I would lie if I wasn't saying like Free Kingdoms wasn't a major shakeup that Total War so desperately needed as a game. Because it was that kind of shakeup that Total War did desperately need as a game. And it really benefited from that particular shake-up in the game. So Total War ended up being far better as an experience because of that. So now suddenly you had the sensical diplomacy choice, and every game since then, Troy, Pharaoh, and Warhammer 3, I would say Warhammer 3 does it the best, but every game since then has handled diplomacy in a far more sensical, practical way than before. It's no longer the case that the AI just suicides itself against you. Now, how does this matter in a meta? Well, aversion. So, beyond faction strength, which dictates diplomacy, aversion is something that matters. Like, there's also specific behaviors for certain legendary lords about, like, them being aggressive or not, protective, etc. But the important thing I would say that actually matters in a campaign is aversion. Now, it can be a positive aversion, like certain races will like certain legendary lord or will like other races. It can be negative ones. In this respect, races like the Dark Elves, Vampire Counts, Tomb Kings actually end up being really good in their campaigns. Not because they are liked by everyone, no, far from it. But because they are in this kind of neutral position, or close enough to a neutral position. Dark Elves are not universally despised by anyone, with the exception of, like, High Elves. Like, no one particularly likes them, that's a different discussion. They don't like each other. But they're in this position where they can pick and choose their allies. And as a result of that, their campaigns can feature a broad range of decisions to make that you would not see in other campaigns. Like, if you're playing a High Elf, like, with the exception of just having to fight the High Elves in a campaign, in a campaign of the Dark Elves, and even then, it's the reason you're fighting High Elves isn't even necessarily down to the aversion situation. It's actually down to the fact that a lot of your victory conditions actually do require you to do it.
Northman, bring your secrets into my chamber.
But with that particular exception,
Bloodthirsty.
With that particular exception of victory conditions, you end up with a lot of flexibility when we're talking about a Dark Elven campaign in terms of allies. Like, consider this particular campaign. I can just as easily ally Mazdamundi as I could turn against Mazdamundi and fight a war against him and maybe sell his territory to Yan Bo. That is a choice. Now, it's not necessarily the best choice. That's a different discussion. I'm not worried, by the way, about Kebie over here. It's not necessarily the best choice, but it is a choice I do have, and a choice I can make in this particular campaign. And it can end up going quite brilliantly for me in that campaign. Like, you can play the Dark Elves and ally Chaos, where you can save the world from the clutches of Chaos and get along quite well with virtually everyone. That is one of the major decisions you're going to have to make in a Dark Elven campaign. And it does actually matter quite a significant amount, I would dare argue, when we're talking about Dark Elven campaigns and how they actually play out. But it's not necessarily just being in an ability to make alliances with everyone. You can also have the reverse situation where everyone dislikes you. Skaven, for instance, are in the situation where virtually everyone dislikes them with the exception of a handful of races. But for the most part, a lot of races dislike Skaven. A lot of races dislike Castors. A lot of races dislike Greenskins. Does that mean Greenskins, Skaven, Castor campaigns are limited? No. Quite the opposite. Since you know everyone dislikes you and you know everyone's going to liable to declare war on you, or far more likely to declare war on you than they otherwise would be, you actually have to make choices in a different way. You have to apply a different logic. In particular, let's say you're playing Draz of the Ashen. Every faction that surrounds you is a faction that might just decide to declare war on you. And that's a dynamic. That's a dynamic in your campaign that you're actually going to have to deal with for the course of that particular campaign. You are going to have to make decisions based on that particular dynamic in a campaign. Good or bad choices. It doesn't necessarily matter. But a campaign can end up blowing up in your face if you obviously make the wrong choices. But it can also open up far more possibilities than you otherwise might have, and that's what makes for a great and wonderful campaign experience that you otherwise simply would not have in any other situation.
No! We beg another chance!
In any other situation. So, either if you're liked or disliked or in a neutral area, that's not really the be-all and end-all. I would say the races that handle the worst are races that are just universally liked, though. Or they're only liked by a certain part of a map. So, for instance, if you're playing a Chaos campaign, you're always going to be liked by other Chaos factions. Like, if we're talking Warriors of Chaos. For Chaos Dwarves, yeah, Chaos likes them, but it doesn't matter, because if you're playing any of Chaos Dwarves campaigns, you're surrounded on all sides from the West Dwarves, Grimgor to the east, unless you're talking about Zaytan, but you've got, like, Greenskins and Dwarves surrounding you, so it's like they both hate you, and then you meet the Empire Cafe. Yeah, they're not necessarily going to like you either, so... Well, the forces of the north like you, but if you're playing any of the Chaos campaigns, with the exception, I guess, Festus, you end up being liked by a lot of your neighbors, and that it doesn't necessarily lead to a great experience from that perspective either. So there has to be a balancing point between all of this, to be clear. And I think like high elves are in a trouble spot in this respect with regards to diplomacy, because a lot of races do like the high elves for obvious reasons. A lot of the order races, and because you may end up surrounded by those, like even Teclis, who's very far away from everyone else, and that lizardmen aren't necessarily the best partners. Even Teclis has a lot of diplomatic flexibility in his campaign that isn't, from my point of view, the best dynamic he could possibly deal with. Just my personal perspective on that. It could be better. There's also some like archaic mechanics for certain races. That's going to be important. Like, for instance, do we need the mechanic that the high elves have right now with regards to manipulation of diplomacy? Do we need a influence manipulation of diplomacy, or is it just an outdated mechanic? Like, high elves are a really strong race, no one disputes that, but do they fit the meta very well? I would say not so much. Yes. They're certainly a good race, they certainly can win campaigns, but beyond diplomacy and climate, there's other things as well, very important things. Like I've said, control, growth, income matter, but here's what really matters: variety of lords, heroes, and units, and actually being able to use that variety of units, lords, and heroes. And this is where certain races shine and others are just left completely in the dust. If you consider a Dark Elf campaign, you've got 4 lord choices, and while certainly 2 of them are the same lord, just one has a shield, the other one has a handbow, and the one with shield is generally better because silver shield is great. You do have some choices, not necessarily the best choices, but then you've got the hero choices. And what's important in a campaign like this is you actually have easy access to a lot of these heroes. With the exception of Knight Assassins and Morafi's campaign, and specifically Morafi's campaign, the other Dark Elf Lords having access to them at tier 3, you get all your hero choices at tier 3. So Masters are tier 2, Death Hags are tier 3. For most campaigns, it's tier 3 for Knight Assassins, and Sorceresses are tier 3, though you do need to do it in a provincial capital. This kind of choice, this kind of flexibility in a campaign is actually far more significant than you might believe during the course of the campaign itself. The reason this is more significant than you might believe is going to boil down to this. Having access to easy variety of heroes means that you have better variety in your armies. Means you have to make choices. How do I balance an army when I can get every hero type in that army? Do I get every hero type? Do I get more units? That's the kind of decision you have to make. But it goes even further with a race like the Dark Elves and, say, Greenskins. You also have a great unit variety. So you get things like Dread Spears being your basic unit, but then tier 2. You get Dark Shards with Shields, really good unit. Black Arc Corsairs, good units. You can use Sisters of Slaughter. You can get Artillery. You can get Black Arc Corsairs with Handbows. You can get Cavalry. You can get Shades. And that's within tier 3. Like Witch Elves. That is all, like Sisters of Slaughter, Witch Elves. That is within tier 3. We're not talking tier 4. This is one of the difference between a good race that works in the meta and a bad race that doesn't really work in the meta, is that accessibility of units. And that's even before you consider things like Black Arcs, which can recruit every unit type and can be mobile recruiting centers on a map. Sure, it pushes you towards naval aggression. This is, by the way, how Norska might want to take some notes over here, because Norska is like, oh, Norska is supposed to be about naval aggression. The Dark Elves do it better. Like, the Dark Elves can capture territory on land, and it's worth it, but they are pushed more towards hugging the coastlines because of the benefits they get from Black Arcs. Something Norska might want to have, just saying there. But how did we get to this stage? How did we get to a point where when you're playing a campaign as, say, the Dwarves, or you're playing a campaign as the Empire, you just feel left behind? The reason with the Dwarves, it's down to just limited selection of units that you can actually use during the course of a campaign, severely diminishing the campaign experience that you can have. With Empire, it's the limitations of things like Imperial Authority and the restrictions that kind of system of Imperial Authority does create in your campaign. With Wood Elves, it's the fact that you have to wait and wait and wait until the trees grow up. Or with Tomb Kings, it's the limitations on how many armies you can have in a campaign. How did we get to a point where these kind of systems are actively hurting campaign variety replayability? Because I would say that's what really being part of the meta is ultimately all about. Replayability, variety, just having a lot of choices. Because as I said, like, there might be a better path for Morathi, but believe it or not, I wouldn't necessarily say, like, do you rush Ulthuan very quickly, or do you send Morathi north? Do you go west? Do you go east over here? Just like within this region, like, do you go west over here versus Kaven early on? Do you go east, try and deal with Astankia now that she's been added in? Various choices that you can make. That's a great campaign. Well, I think for a very long time, Creative Assembly was really focused on, like, ever since, I would say, Shogun 2 in particular, what they've been focused on is kind of combating a particular player behavior that started occurring in actually Rome 1 and Medieval 2. It was already happening, but I think it vastly accelerated with respect to Empire and Napoleon, because gunpowder and weapons can inflict staggering losses, and the AI was really stupid in those games that you could abuse the hell out of it. So what players ended up doing in Empire and Napoleon is they were abusing the hell out of the AI and winning battles with minimal casualties. Now, Creative Assembly's solution to all of this was not to improve the AI, make it better, though they would eventually do so. It took them a long time. Rather, Creative Assembly's solution was to just add difficulty layers, so public order modifiers, giving the AI significant cheats in terms of income, giving the AI free experience, just a huge amount of cheats that the AI would use again and again and again in their campaigns against the player. And this would continue until it reached the head with Warhammer 2. That's when we got to the maximum point, really, of difficulty bullshit. Well, I would say Warhammer 2 was not quite exceptional compared to some of the other games that we had gotten from Creative Assembly by that point. But it was just a culmination of something that had started with Shogun 2. And it was not a great campaign experience from my point of view. For all the things Warhammer 2 does well, and it certainly does them, for all those things, I would say one of the big negatives of Warhammer 2 is the following point. That the AI is suicidal against the player, that factions have a significant amount of aggression, and that you have a significant public order modifier, which, by the way, is still the case very much even in Warhammer 3. All of that is not great. And it's all driven by this desire to limit the player, limit the campaigns. What this really resulted in is players cheesing the hell out of their campaigns, but also playing a lot of the intern button simulator, because one of the best things you could do in a campaign in Warhammer 1 or 2 is like you would expand to a certain point where it was safe, and the safety point depended greatly on the campaign you were playing. Like if you were playing, say, a foreground campaign, your initial province was relatively safe. After that, you've got Grimgore to the south and many other orc factions to the south, greenskin factions to the south. You got the Bloody Spears to the north. Moving either north or south is going to create a lot of problems for you, because the factions in the other direction are going to come for you. So what do? Do you recruit another army to guard your border? That's not necessarily going to work, because all the free AI experience that it gets, it's meaning that your secondary army is not going to be able to handle it. Hell, your main army may not be able to handle the threat that's in front of it, given the vast amount of unit numbers and free unit experience that the AI gets. And you don't have that free unit experience in Warhammer 2. This is one of the reasons I would not play Warhammer 2 again. So instead, what was the best solution? Find the settlement, sack it again and again and again, abuse the hell out of that particular system, abuse the hell out of that particular dynamic in a campaign, and just get a lot of experience. So you would waste a lot of turns during the course of your campaign doing precisely this. Would I say that was a great experience? No, I would not. And I think you'll understand why. It wasn't exactly a great experience to engage in during the course of a campaign. What they ended up doing with respect to Warhammer 3 that was very different is they really toned down the bullshit of difficulty in a campaign compared to what we had been dealing with before. So while there still is a huge amount of bullshit, it ended up a situation where you no longer, like if you're playing a foreground campaign, you no longer had to stop, because suddenly there was it wasn't quite parity, but the dynamics of difficulty, even on something like Legendary. This is Legendary very hard. Sure, I'm using an Autoresolve modifier to not have to fight the battles manually, but I could have won every battle over here. I couldn't say the same about the Warhammer 2 campaign. Suffice to say, that's not the dynamic you might have to deal with. That's a different dynamic. So suddenly the early game became a lot more fair towards the player in Warhammer in Warhammer 3. Problem is, we had gotten used to playing that, so that's why, we can get away with a lot of nonsense in a campaign. We were used to far worse. Like, you play a campaign where by turn 20, minor factions have silver ranked units, like Zafri having silver ranked units within the first 10-20 turns, and you're playing Tyrion. It's like, sheesh, that's insane. You kind of realize that the best thing to do as Tyrion is not to attack Zafri directly there. Just find a nice cozy settlement to sack again and again, and that's actually your best bet of a campaign plan. That obviously was not a great gameplay experience, but it was the best way to play. And if you're not willing to cheese that, well, you would flat out lose a campaign, because the AI would be suicidally aggressive even on a low difficulty level, let alone on a high one. So, Total War Cheesehammer was really born with that. It wasn't great, but they've toned it down. Problem is, now we're in a situation where the meta is capturing a lot of territory, because you no longer have those AI cheats, and the AI. I think the AI really needs some scalability, but even if it had that scalability, it still wouldn't change the dynamic that having good growth, having good income, having access to lords and heroes, and increasing their capacity at tier 3, and thus implicitly from minor settlements, obviously gives far more flexibility in that campaign than it does to have very, very limited forces or only increasing capacity. People talk about playing tall. Well, right now the game is not built around playing tall. And I think in order for the game to be built around playing tall, as opposed to, besides just artificial player decisions, like just the players deciding, okay, we're just going to sit on our asses and do nothing over here. Outside of certain people deciding to do something like that, right now, the game is certainly built around the idea of being very aggressive during the course of a campaign, taking a significant amount of territory, Also, you can get quest items very quickly in a campaign right now, as opposed to having to do those quests, which honestly was really annoying. Like, you know, you play an Alarial campaign in Warhammer 2, go find Norska. I'm like, why would I go find Norska for a quest battle? Like, that's another thing that they really did well. So, lords with legendary lords that have a lot of quest items are certainly very, very powerful. And as I said, some races were not designed for this. Like, they just inherently were not designed to deal with this kind of situation. They were designed for the old balancing. You can bet your ass that certain races... What's curious to note about Warhammer 3 is that the best races aren't races for Warhammer 3. With the exception of Kebie. Like, Kebie is a really good race. Not necessarily best. They still have crap casualty replenishment. But Kebie is a really good race within the context of Warhammer 3. Developed for Warhammer 3 at launch. Chaos Dwarves are a pretty solid race, not necessarily the S tier, but still in a very good enough position. But it's Dark Elves, Skaven, Greenskins, Vampire Counts, so shockingly enough, to handle the new meta very, very well. And certain races, the Order races in particular, that don't. I think there certainly was Creative Assembly may have went too far to try and counter the effects of the Order tide, so Confederations are pretty annoying to pull off, though honestly they're probably still better than Warhammer 2. Like, it's not like Confederations were easy to pull off in Warhammer 2. They were annoying there as well. I think we need a more sensical system of Confederation, I would say. By the way, just gonna lay it out there. Like, yeah, Confederations can be a bit silly and nonsensical in a campaign right now. And maybe they shouldn't be. Maybe they shouldn't be. In a campaign, but they are. I also believe that there's plenty of other features that Creative Assembly should implement. But one of the important things with respect to one of the important things with respect to Warhammer 3.
Beyond compare.
Oh yes, that is sweet. But one of the important things with respect to Warhammer 3 is really going to be the fact that races that get access to heroes fairly quickly in their campaigns are going to do better than the races that do not. And races that have a greater variety of unit recruitment and units that are actually worth recruiting in the first place, that's one of the problems in the Empire, that a lot of their units aren't worth recruiting, are just going to do better. And you're going to have a better experience about that. Sure, you might argue that the game doesn't have to be played and won within the first 40 turns, but I got a newsflash for you. It was always decided within the first 40 turns. You can look back at Rome 1. You tell me a Rome 1 campaign is not decided in the first 40 turns? Sure, you might have things like the Mongols and the Timurids, especially when you're a more inexperienced player, completely ruining your campaign. But for the most part, Total War campaigns have always been decided in the early game. Everything else was a grind. I don't care what people say about Realm Divide. Realm Divide was an annoyance, not a challenge. So right now, like, you play, and even in those long campaigns, having limitations on unit variety, having limitations on recruitment of units and lords and heroes, just means you have, it doesn't mean you're running around with less armies, but with just as many heroes. It just means you're running around with less heroes. And that's the problem I have in a High Elven campaign, for instance. That you don't have a reason in a High Elven campaign to ever slow down. Like, that's something you can win in the Dwarven campaign and capture a lot of territory very quickly. But will you ever use a different army than the Quarreler Doomstack? I doubt that, sincerely. Because there's almost never any reason to do so, is there? In a campaign, in a campaign as the dwarves, there's almost never any reason to choose a different path in those kind of campaigns. So, you just end up winning the campaign, but you end up with less variety. And I think just having that variety in general, faster for certain races, would absolutely improve the campaign experience for a lot of these races. And that's my point. Also, just, you know, what that variety actually is, how it looks, how it plays out. That's all I had to say. Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.